Let me just, go back to two things you said. One is, I think there are two separate issues, right? I think one is about convincing political leaders about the return to, say, investing in these public goods in an electoral cycle. So, and this is in fact exactly the motivation for our smart card paper, you see, because one of the things we write there is that in a world of the political economy leans towards more programs, because this is a program that you can announce, it's a program that you can target to your preferred voter groups, it's a program that allows for patronage. But you don't nearly have the same set of incentives for investment in state implementation capacity, partly because of the perception that this payoff is beyond the electoral cycle. And so I think in some ways the main contribution of our smart card paper is to say that even in a period of 2 years, even in a period when the implementation was only 50% complete, that this investment pays for itself within 2 years. I mean that in fact what we calculate is that the time saving to beneficiaries alone pays for the entire program. So in the spirit of the deworming, in the spirit of that conversation, of these kind of little interventions paying for themselves. So, that's kind of the thing. But I do think there is a little bit more work for economists to do here rather than kind of just move the burden to the politicians, because I think the question here is, sitting in the CEA's office, to what extent is there analysis of the marginal public dollar, the marginal public rupee, the relative return to allocating that across sectors? Even without kind of RCT type evidence, is that at least a framework of thinking that happens?
That is certainly a framework of thinking. I have to say, India certainly has the sophistication of doing that. Mm-hmm. So you don't get hard results, mm-hmm. but we were all the time, this is, I'm going back to what I used to do there, had people actually doing computations of the benefits that you will get from this particular intervention and that particular intervention. Mm-hmm. But you also know that when you're doing it with some broad macroeconomic data, mm-hmm. how certain this is, there's a big question mark. And how much of that analysis you can do in-house is also questionable. So this is the kind of area where the research that takes place in the Ministry of Finance, the research that takes place in the Reserve Bank of India, mm-hmm. needs to interface more with research that is taking place by independent bodies outside, mm-hmm. and bring that to the table to have even more persuasive data. Mm-hmm. So like your smart card work, mm-hmm. I feel that that would help a lot, because the smart card is a very good example where there was a lot of discussion, I don't know if you remember, on the smart card mm-hmm. that would take place. We were producing bits and pieces of evidence, mm-hmm. some analysis that this is going to work very well. But politics is very strange, and this, I'm not saying it's politics as done by politicians, but the political mood of the country. Mm-hmm. These things go in for swings of opinion, and once that begins to pick up, you can push in certain policies which at other times you cannot. Mm-hmm. One just hopes that a combination of doing research, public discussions, which is more important than the research is the backdrop, mm-hmm. you have to get it from the research, public discussion, public discourse, and enlightened journalism, I see several of them here, is just so important. You have to write not just a two-liner on something, but also have a full page describing a policy analysis so that the few people who will read will understand this. One more thing I should tell you, this is sitting in the World Bank, I feel very strongly, is in that sort of traditional Bretton Woods organization, World Bank and IMF of 20 years ago, there was a bit of a tendency to go down to developing countries and preach. You call the finance minister and say, this is the way you should behave. You call the central bank governor and preach. There was a lot of reaction to that. Mm-hmm. Now when I travel around, and I'm not just talking about India, I'd go to a small country in West Africa, I'll go to somewhere else, an island country, the level of discussion you have with the top policymakers is pretty much the same that you would have it in London or Washington. And Delhi, certainly that's the case, because Delhi, the top policymakers are the best ideas. They are reading the same magazines, they are reading the same journals, they are plugged in. It is this, the picking up of the momentum from that, and so that it becomes something which is being debated countrywide, which creates the space to drive, which is very important. Just telling politicians you should do this, most of the time they know that. Mm-hmm. Take, for instance, a critical subsidy. You're talking of some LPG subsidy or something else. Most of the discussion, if you talk about the benefits and costs of the subsidy, the politicians would have read the same things, the top politicians. Mm-hmm. They will know that. Mm-hmm. But they also have a pulse of the mood of the country. Mm-hmm. So I feel some public discourse, Amartya Sen stresses that repeatedly. Mm-hmm. I feel the public discourse, having it at a level where people have a slightly better understanding can give us a very, very big mileage.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, exactly what we're trying to do with this kind of forum. And, I think in my own kind of experience working in sectors, the one thing that I think economists, so there's, I guess, 3 levels at which we can share our work. I mean, there is dissemination, which is what we do when we come to a seminar and give a talk. There is recommendation, which is saying, based on what I know, this is what I would say you would do. And then there's actually advocacy of saying, this is what you should do. And I think most of us would steer very far of that last part. Like, I think at most, the furthest we would go out on a limb is to say, make a recommendation. But I think one thing we probably don't do enough is going back to this discussion we were having earlier, is any policy change kind of has winners and losers, right? And so how do you kind of take this policy change and do the work of crafting it through the political economy, of how do you make either vested interests, there's one, so let's take a simple example. Let's take electricity subsidies, right? Free electricity for farmers. It's, to most of us, would be one of the most distortionary policies out there. It's unbelievably regressive. It damages the water table. It damages the cropping pattern. It's something that's one of these no-brainers. Now, when you talk to any politician, he'll say this, we can't touch this for farmers, right? So this type of analysis I would like to see would be something very simple. All it would take would be kind of an incidence analysis of the subsidy, a very simple graph that is kind of indexing from the lowest to the highest percentile of the beneficiaries and just showing how convex that benefit schedule is, and then doing the work to say that you could go to the 80th percentile of this usage and then provide that amount of free power to everybody. To anybody who uses less than that, you sell that back and it's effectively a straight income transfer, but then we have marginal pricing on the margin. Now, the political kind of cleverness of a design like that is now you've got a voting majority, who's going to, by revealed preference, vote for something like that. So that is not something that I see as veering into the world of advocacy. I just see that as kind of saying, here is economists putting on a lens of political feasibility and then presenting a proposal for something like that to go through.
Karthik, here I have one disagreement. I feel, and this is a disagreement not with you, but with the economics profession. We very often feel that as soon as you write down a policy which is, and you show that it's beneficial for the majority, you will get a political majority voting for this. I don't think so. Somehow, I can think of a lot of agricultural interventions in this country which are not good for, especially for the mass of people. But the few people at the top in agriculture can persuade a lot of people or build up a mood where even if it's very clear that 60% or 80% of the bottom segment of the poor farmers will benefit, but the top end will lose out a little bit, you can't get it through because somehow the mood will be different and
so I don't disagree at all. So in fact, my point here is that I don't think that the economists can kind of influence the political process, but I'm going back to what you said about creating the larger mood and the larger discussion. See, I have not seen this incidence graph. You see, having this incidence graph go out paper after paper, but I think would just make a big difference.
So you have to have that, but with that there is a political economy exercise, and I'll give you one very concrete example. I used to have a small home in Bihar, now in Jharkhand, used to have, I don't have it anymore, where I would go down once a year, once in 2 years. I remember once, this was after my father passed away, I went there and someone came asking for me to pay up my electricity bill that had accumulated. And I was about to pay when the villagers came and told me that, sir, over here, no one pays for their electricity. If you pay, it'll be a very antisocial act. And I remember I was caught in a dilemma that should I be antisocial and the entire village doesn't do that, I violate, or should I just set an example? I don't remember now what I did. This was many years ago. But I do remember I was just taken aback by appealing to almost morals as to why I should not pay. And this is, I think, we have to understand. I agree with you. We have to get data, we have to get the incidents, we have to sensitize people. But getting the masses also to understand that, look, your interests, you have to understand your own interests better. Then we can produce the data and the evidence, and you should not be guided by the few leaders who have a voice in the village. So the sort of democratic understanding, broader understanding, a direct engagement with the people. What I'm saying in a nutshell is, talking to policymakers is important, but talking to the masses, they get a slightly better understanding is important. Economists play a role in this, journalists play a role in this, and we have to give a lot of attention to that.
Exactly. I mean, I don't think we disagree at all, right? Yeah. I mean, I think all I'm saying is, like, in terms of moving the needle slightly towards the masses, understanding better what is in their own interests, I think, you know, so I was just suggesting, I mean, that the one thing that economists are probably not doing enough is kind of, you know, we normally say this is a policy that we recommend based on analysis and step back, but kind of doing the additional step of thinking through where the political economy hurdles are and then just communicating in a way, because all I'm saying is this is a sort of incidence graph that I can easily see if it's made available, say, sector after sector on subsidies, that not just the English papers, but in theory, eventually one should push this down to the Hindi media. I mean, and that's where kind of people are forming their opinions. And so, you know, I was just thinking about how can academic economists do more, like, need to make sure that some of this work is reflected better.